Hello, this is Jeremiah Bannister, and you're listening to Catholic versus Catholic.
So just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you believe, and how you came to believe what you believe.
Okay, my name is Jeremiah Bannister. I'm a Roman Catholic, and I've been many things throughout my life, and honestly, I've only been back in the church since Christmas Eve of 2017. And if you go back far enough in my storyline, I was raised charismatic Pentecostal, and I became a Calvinist while I was in Bible college. I overheard a debate between two RAs that had to do with predestination and free will, and I found it compelling. And I was very intrigued by it. So I read the Institutes and John Calvin, and I read R.C. Sproul and others, and became a Calvinist and eventually a presuppositionalist. I went for a very, very brief period of time. I went to seminary for presuppositional apologetics. I studied theonomic ethics and law. Eventually decided that I wanted to get an MDiv, but then we had our first child. And in New Jersey, if you don't have insurance, and we thought we did, but we did not, and when that happens, you're looking paying to the tune of about $25,000. And so there was really no way to continue going for my seminary program. So I took a job as a chief aide to a lobbyist, a conservative Christian lobbyist, and I was the suit and briefcase guy, right? Suit and tie briefcase guy in Trenton, New Jersey, walking the streets or the halls of the Capitol with him, and driving around doing all different kinds of events and coordinating things. And I did that. I worked as an associate youth pastor. Eventually moved back to Michigan, back to my hometown of Battle Creek. That's Cereal City, USA, where Kellogg's and Post are from. And so we moved back there, my wife and I took a job as an associate pastor of a Baptist church. And I was there for a while and did quite well, but I was eventually given an ultimatum. The ultimatum was either I had to abandon my Calvinism and be a Southern Baptist pastor and take over for the one that was retiring, or I had to leave. There was no in between. It was simply you're either not gonna be a Calvinist or you're not gonna be the pastor here. And it was an easy choice. I've never done something like, I'll just stop being a Calvinist so I can be a pastor. I thought that was absurd. So I took my stuff, walked out the door, but decided that I may want to consider going back to school. But before entering into school again to go for journalism, which I eventually went for, and that's pretty much what I do now with radio and other stuff, I began blogging and making videos on YouTube in the early days of YouTube, and I was doing a lot of blogging before that on Zanga, if anybody remembers that. That's kind of back in the day. MySpace was still totally awesome. People knew what that was. They were all friends with that same guy in the white T-shirt. I don't even know whatever happened to him, but anyway. So I was writing all of these blogs, and my main thing, other than politics, my main thing was trying to convert Catholic people to Protestantism, because I was convinced that Catholicism was this idolatrous cult. And so I was writing things all the time. Well, I was getting to meet, new people in the blogosphere, people from all over the country. And a lot of Catholic people began commenting, and I had a pretty decent-sized audience of people. I'd average at that time probably, let's say 80 to 100, maybe even up to 120 comments under many of my posts throughout the day. So, I was having a lot of people and a lot of engagement back and forth. It wasn't like two people posting a bazillion things. We're talking a lot of individuals coming in and talking. So it was a lot of traction. It was a lot of fun. But I began learning something real quickly, and that was that my understanding of Catholicism was entirely based on Protestants writing about Catholicism. So I never read anything. The closest I ever got to Catholicism, there were two instances. One was growing up, my dad was a radio guy. He was a manager of a Christian station, and he used to get CDs all the time on the cheap because the distributors, he had a connection with them. And I had a bunch of these Gregorian chant CDs. And it was really, I just loved them. It was one of the main things I listened to, I think, my 11th grade year in high school. And so I fell in love with chant. And the other thing was I'd read a book about St. Francis of Assisi, and I was so impressed. And I'd known also, oh, goodness gracious, what is his name? John Michael Talbot. My dad also had CDs and records of John Michael Talbot and the Little Portion Hermitage and stuff. And so I knew of them. And so I read this book about St. Francis of Assisi, and I was so impressed by it. And so I actually went to, I made a call, and I really thought about this. And I was praying, and I was thinking, like, man, I don't know, I kind of want to live like that a little bit. And so I called the Little Portion Hermitage, and I talked to him on the phone. This is while I was in Bible college down in Dallas, Texas, a Pentecostal college. And they said, okay, well, what parish do you go to? You know, what diocese are you in? I said, what are you talking about? I didn't even know what they meant by that. I had no clue. And they said, I said, diocese? I said, what are you talking about? And they really quickly realized, they're like, are you a Catholic? And I said, oh, no way. I didn't understand this. And they said, well, that is kind of a precondition. So I never made my way into the Hermitage. But other than that, I knew nothing of Catholicism at all. And so my friends online that I was debating with, and all of them were quite traditional and conservative. Most of them were Latin Mass of one kind or another, or they went to an ordinary form Mass that was very conservative. So this is back before the motu proprio with Benedict XVI. And so the people were either FSSP, there were some SSPX, the Society of Pope Pius X, and a handful of Eastern Orthodox people, some Byzantine Catholic people. So these were individuals, very few individuals who were kind of your normies, your ordinary form Catholic people. Right? There wasn't a lot of that, and they all encouraged me to read certain saints. So I read Francis de Sales. I read St. Alphonsus. They sent me the Catechism of Trent. I read the whole thing. I went back and I started reading the early saints. So I read 1st century, 2nd century, started reading Ignatius, for example, Polycarp, Clement, the Didache. I was reading the early things, church history and stuff like that. And so was super impressed by it. And as far as I know, I even bought a book called The Mass, and it's the history of the Mass, and it was written at a time before the Latin Mass, and so there was before the Novus Ordo, and so that was the only Mass they were really talking about. They talked about other rites included in that, but it was mainly the Latin Mass. So when I eventually, after a year and a half of kicking against the goads on this, I eventually came to a place where I couldn't get around it anymore. And I remember the day I told my wife, she was still sleeping, and I knelt next to the bed, and I told her, I said, I'll crawl to Mass. I don't care anymore. I can't go to a Protestant church anymore. I just can't do it. And I said, but you're welcome to continue. If you want to use the car, you're welcome to. But I said, this was a weekday. And she said, where you go, I go. I have an amazing wife. And she's been with me through thick and thin, and I love her with all my heart. But that was a powerful thing, that decision she made. So that day I went to my first Mass, and when I went in, I thought that it was going to be a Latin Mass, and it wasn't. I was very confused. I said, what is this? And I actually went up and I asked him. I said, it was weird because it wasn't in Latin, and everybody's kind of looking at me cross-eyed, thinking, what's up with this guy? And I just didn't know. But I was very interested in going. I didn't care. So I said, well, I'm glad to be where I am, and I'm behind this decision of moving forward. So we became Catholic, and our daughter was baptized. My wife and I were conditionally baptized. Our son was just born, I think about a week before the baptism. So that's how we came into the church. And we were in the church after that for about 4 years, 4.5, and I taught catechism, at the church. I was very involved. I made a lot of videos. I wrote a lot of blogs. I had a radio show, a TV program, local TV program. So I was very, very, very active. But I think it kind of hurt me to do that, to go right from being a Protestant pastor and immediately through, even though the conversion process was long, well, a year and a half at least, and it was this intense thing of studying and learning. I never just immersed myself and kind of sat like a child at the feet of the Lord, just saying, look, I need to learn this. I'm not raised this way. I have tendencies and enthusiasms that have developed, and those, I was like a stallion that had just never been trained properly. And so I went crazy. I went wild, and I was persuaded by, I was frustrated by things going on in the church. I was frustrated by things because I had only studied early documents. I was frustrated by things I was seeing, and I was struggling to put them together and to make sense of changes and everything else. And I became persuaded of sedevacantism. And I became a sedevacantist. It took me about 7 months to realize that is a cult. And so that was not good. And I said, oh no, and we can talk about that whenever later. But it's a tragic thing, right? It's a tragic situation with them. And I don't want to just blast everybody in that as if they're bad people. The structure itself and the hierarchy, I think that there's serious problems with it. But the experience of the worship there, the experience of the morals that you have, the sacraments, the way they're done, it's beautifully nostalgic right, for a Catholic that loves the past. And so, but we eventually found our way out of there, and we got to a place. And by this time, I was in college, going for journalism, is liberal arts college with the UCC, the Universalist Unitarian Church, right? And so that was the church that was affiliated. It was also a congregational church that the pastor would have been rolling over in his grave if he knew what had happened to and what they'd been aligned with and everything else. And so I found myself learning things that, whether it was the age of the universe and evolutionary theory, Darwinism, naturalism, and all of these things kind of coming at me. And I was also going through all of these doubts having to do with what's up with the church, right? These questions, what's gone wrong with this? What's happening with this? And the times we're in. And I just accepted the idea. I said, if Catholicism is not true, if I come to the belief that Catholicism, whether it's internal contradictions or whatever, that Catholicism is phony baloney, then there's no other religion out there for me. I'm not going to go back to Protestantism. That's absurd, right? I left that for a good reason. I'm not going to become a Muslim. I'm not going to become a Hindu or a Buddhist or an Eskimo. I'm not going to become any of these things because I don't believe that they can account or that they have a coherent worldview that can account for how we live, move, and have our being in this universe. And so I believe there are problems with these things. So I said, maybe we don't even have a God. I was agnostic. And I took a position that said I don't know either which way. And I was doubtful and frustrated about it. And it took about 2 years before I used the word atheist to describe myself, but I eventually did. And for 7 years, I was outside the church for 7 years. I left my role as, I was, of course, speaking and doing things at Catholic churches or at organizations, homeschool groups and things like that. And so I stopped doing that. I was no longer doing a talk radio program. I decided, that's a big change. I left. I was a contributing editor for the Distributist Review, and I resigned that post. They offered for me to stay, but I said, you guys are a coherent bunch of Catholic people. I mean, that's actually the strength of your group. And I still maintained distributism, though. In fact, I still retained a lot of my conservative and even traditional beliefs and values while I was an atheist. And eventually, that landed me in a weird quagmire, what I think Charles Taylor calls cross pressures. Right? You have these cross pressures in life, and between your social group and your values, and social groups that are outside of yours that may have values like yours but dogmas that you don't share. And so you're caught between these two icebergs that are crushing you in between. And so, found myself in that place. But I eventually returned to radio as an atheist, and I was a very outspoken opponent of Christianity. And I didn't talk too much about Catholicism. That was my main thing. I mean, I did do one speech about it where I criticized Catholicism. But beyond that, it was just a lot of, general American Christianity, a lot of low-hanging fruit. And there are even still some videos online of me describing my reasons for leaving and why I believe that I was a Christian, because there were people who said I was never a Christian, Calvinist people who said, well, if he left us, he was never with us. That stuff's available, but about 5 years in, my daughter, the one that was born in New Jersey, the $25,000 kid, right, that one, and she was worth way more than that. She was worth everything to me. She was diagnosed with an anaplastic astrocytoma. That is one of the world's most aggressive and wicked forms of childhood brain cancer. And the life expectancy is very, very small. And through all of this, through the experiences with my daughter, okay, through the things that we went through, I was furious at God. I could not believe that, I already didn't believe, but I now especially could not, because I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that a loving God could create a world wherein an awesome, beautiful, and brilliant 12-year-old girl would get brain cancer. And I watched her suffer. I watched her die in my own home, and I carried her out. She was in a state of rigor mortis. Her skin was freezing cold. And I've never seen someone dead other than in a casket at a viewing. I've never seen somebody go through that process before. I carried her in my arms to the hearse in the road. And I mean, death was in my arms, and death was in my heart. And for the next year, I raged in my heart against God. But I found myself eventually doubting my doubt. I began doubting my doubt even before she died. In fact, there were things that I would say, it was like sabotaging my daughter's doubts, right? She wasn't a God-hater, but she was never, since 3 years old, she'd never gone to church. We never prayed with her. But she loved life, and she wanted to know. In fact, she wanted to go to different churches because she didn't understand why people did things, but she wanted to. And she told me something before she died. She told me, because we talked, in fact, it's before I even knew she had cancer, the night before. We first discovered something was wrong, and 48 hours before we found out it was cancer. We were watching this cartoon called Super Friends. It's this Hanna-Barbera cartoon with Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, Catwoman, and all this. And we're sitting there and we're watching it, and we later ended up watching this documentary about Darwin. But at the end of the show, we were really upset about something we'd seen in the Darwin documentary about Darwin's daughter dying. I didn't know that before that. And I told her, I said, I would never go back to church. If I ever lost a child, I would never, ever, ever go back. And she kind of held her hand awkwardly, and it was because, come to find out, she'd been hiding something about her inability to write for about 2 weeks. She didn't tell us. Because the brain tumor had affected her fingers and her ability to grip things. And so she grabbed her hand and she said, I know you'd be real sad if something like that, nobody wants a kid to die, but I don't want you to hate ever. And I was angry. I mean, my teeth were grit talking this conversation. Just the idea, it was so repugnant. The idea of losing a child, it was so terrible and dreadful. Just even think about. And she wanted me to never hate, and told me that the reason why is because that we have family and friends. All of our family and many of our best friends believed in God. And she said, and I love them with all my heart, no matter what. And she said, promise me. Now, it's cryptic in hindsight to think about that this conversation is happening, and the girl that's saying it knows something's wrong with her, but she can't imagine what it is, and I had no clue. And here it was a tumor the size of a golf ball in her brain that within the next 5 days she would end up having a 17-hour brain surgery to get it out. But that message stuck with me. Don't hate. I was angry, confused, furious about the situation, but that idea, that admonition to step up and to overcome that desire to hate in a terrible situation, to hate people you would otherwise love with all of your heart, it kept pounding away at me. And over time, I found myself, for a lot of reasons, political and otherwise, finding myself becoming less and less associated with the atheist community that I was involved with at the time. And I was very involved with them, even on the board of the state chapter of Center for Inquiry on the state board, and very, very active, doing speeches all over the place, a whole bunch. And so, after time, and I'll end it with this, on how I came back and why I'm back. So my kids, I have 4, and now we lost 1 and we were down to 3, and we have 4 now, right? But at the time, after our daughter died, there were 3 that remained, and you'll hear the Catholicism of old come out in their names. The first is Athanasius, the second one is Ambrose, and the third one is Teresa Avila Lucille. So just, all doctors of the church, right? I mean, so Teresa of Avila, Ambrose, Athanasius. And my 3 kids, we've always been really involved with them. And we have a very good relationship. We talk a lot. But my kids, this would be the summer of 2017. My kids come up to me individually, right? Different times, about 2 weeks separated from each other. And my daughter, she was playing Legos. And she's laying on the floor, and I'm kind of just reading a book by her, and she looks up at me and she says, "Hey, Papa, who built the builders?" And I thought, what a weird question. And I thought maybe she's talking about the Legos and what she was playing with. And I said, "I don't know who made those." She goes, "No," she said, "of the whole universe." And so she was asking a question about where we came from. How did we get here? And I told her, I said, I wish I had that answer. I'd be like a best-selling author right now. I would be making boatloads of loot if I had a definitive answer. This is exactly how it happened, and I can just demonstrate this and whatnot. And so, kind of laughed about it. But I thought about it. So this is, she's thinking deep questions, big considerations. About a week later or so, my son Athanasius, he comes up, and we're talking. He got in an argument with his mama, and I don't really like that. Papa Bear doesn't like arguments with Mama. It never goes good. And so we're talking about, honoring your mother and your father. And so I'm still relying on these traditional concepts, these conservative, traditional Christian concepts. And I'm talking to him, but he asked me, he says, he started asking questions about, but why do I need to do that? Why should I understand what you're saying? Well, yeah, but it's nicer. I mean, you want people to treat you a certain way, right? Yeah, but what if I want to treat this person that way? Do I have to behave a certain way? Who says I have to? These were all questions of authority. These were questions of, by what standard are you determining that this is how I ought to live? How must I live? And what's the penalty Who says and why? So this is deep stuff. Something was, man, what's up with this? And then the last one, my son Ambrose, he was playing puppets outside. They all have these really cool chef puppets. There's a certain name for them. But they're all playing with them and everything. And he says, Papa, I need to talk to you in private. I said, okay. So he leads me upstairs. We go to his room, and he closes the door all kind of secretively. And he stands there and he says, I have to tell you a secret. I said, what's that, buddy? And he said, well, sit down. So I sat down on his bed, and he paused for a second. And he looked at me. You could tell he was nervous, and he said, Papa, I pray. And I didn't know how to handle that because I didn't teach that little dude how to do that. I don't know. I don't even know who did. I don't know if anybody actually did. In fact, I asked him, and he said, no, nobody taught me. I found out that he prayed before. He'd been at somebody's house, and he saw people pray. But nobody actually sat down with him and explained what prayer is and how you do it or anything. And so I wasn't really treating him very well about it. I wasn't being, super rude, and I was being somewhat playful, but it wasn't nice what I said. I said, oh, so is God like talking to you? And he looked at me and he says, no. He said, it's not like God's talking in my ear, and he used his little puppet, like talking by his ear. It's kind of funny. And then he paused, and he looked down at his little feet shuffling on the ground, and then he looked at me in the face, and he said, but I still think it's the right thing to do. And then he walked out of the room and left me there. So I'm like, at this point, all three of my kids are asking these crazy questions, and I'm thinking that they're all, colluding with each other. They're all scheming against their dad. So I get ticked off, and I'm like, time out, and they're freaking out, and I storm down the stairs, and I'm pointing at him, and I'm blaming him, saying, what's going on with this? Are you guys talking and everything? And they weren't. These were spontaneous conversations that had to do with things that either they had done by themselves, or situations like arguing or playing with Legos and thinking about building and then thinking about whatever it was. There was no plot. Right? There was no scheme here. And so it was this really organic thing that just happened. And I had to think about it. And we got talking, and then same little guy, Ambrose, he asked me, he said, Papa, are we Catholic? And that was the beginning of the end for us, right? As atheists. That's what eventually led, because, we explained, yes, and, you're baptized, you have Catholic names, we haven't gone to church. And then, they started asking questions about church, and they asked to go to Ambrose's godmother's church, because she always sent us nativity pieces. And this was around Christmas time. And so we decided to go, and it was in town, and we went. And when we got there, we not only discovered, of course, she lived in town. We didn't realize that at the time. We thought she lived in a different place. So it was kind of cool that she was there. But we very quickly learned, as the procession was walking down the center toward the altar, that the priest that we had before our apostasy had also been relocated now to where we live now, which is in Grand Rapids. This is about, an hour and 10 minutes from where we used to go, and almost an hour and a half from the church where he used to be the priest, And so we were surprised. We didn't know he was there. We had no clue. And my wife and I, we weren't in our hearts ready to come back yet, but our kids wanted to keep going, even though there wasn't candy. And I told them that. I said, look, Father Sirico, he's the priest at Sacred Heart in Grand Rapids, and he gave candy to the kids on Christmas Eve. He had kids come up, and a guy who owns a factory that makes a bunch of chocolate. He gives them all this candy for the kids. And so they come up and everything, and they're like, we get candy, Papa, look at this. And they loved it, And I said, well, there's not candy at the next one, thinking it was going to dissuade them. Oh, no, it didn't dissuade them. And now, a year and a half later, they're serving the High Mass in the extraordinary form at the Sacred Heart. And I am being trained now as a thurifer at the Mass. I serve at Holy Hour. I've served at Low Mass. And our kids are enrolled in a classical education Catholic school where they learn Latin and the saints, and they have Mass every single morning. The ordinary form, except for high holy days and stuff like that, where special days or events where they'll have the traditional Latin Mass, but it's the ordinary form other than that. And my wife is in a women's Bible group, and she's part of a group of ladies that after Mass go up and pray, in the front of the church. And we're very involved. But that's my story.
Interesting. So what were the major hurdles the first time you became Catholic and the second time? Were they the same hurdles or were they completely different hurdles?
Very different. The first time, it was pretty common hurdles. I mean, like...
Authority?
Well, yeah, authority, sola scriptura, not so much sola fide. I'd already sacrificed that on, with the federal vision, Douglas Wilson and others and their kind of view, reformed is not enough kind of stuff. And all my friends said, that's a golden brick road to Rome. And I said, oh, no, that's cuckoo pants. You're you're out of your mind. I'm not going to become Catholic. And, yeah. But, so the things to do, Virgin Mary, stuff like icons, and eventually these things began peeling away. And really, and part of it was pride. The two I'll focus on that were really tough. One was sola scriptura. And I got to a point where I was getting so frustrated because I was looking around at how inefficient sola scriptura was. Number one, I reject the idea that it's self-evident, the canon, right? Like somehow we can just look at Jude and go, yes. 100%, man, that's supposed to be there. It was obviously not self-evident to the church in the beginning because there were divergent canons. And St. Athanasius, in fact, I named my son after someone who played a significant role in being someone who had the New Testament canon in order, that we have now, and if not the first, one of the first to have done that. And so I remember I told my wife, I said, I do a lot of writing, and I wanted to write a play. I enjoy doing videos and writing little screenplays and skits and stuff, and I wanted to make this play where there was a guy who had these really deep questions about life and the afterlife and death and sin and salvation and stuff. And throughout the play, as he's asking these questions, people come from different sides. Different characters would come out, from the side and be introduced into the scene. And these characters would, by some mechanism, they would, some spectacle, you would be able to identify what denominational affiliation, or get at least some idea of where they're coming from and the words they use and the style of their voice and stuff. And have throughout the play, as this is going, let's say you have people come out who are Baptist and then Methodist and then your Oneness Pentecostal people, and so you've got your whole gang, people from all the different denominations start to come out, right? And you'd have to limit it because there's about a bazillion of these denominations. So, stick with the big dogs and maybe some outliers. But to bring them around, and eventually as it gets going, it's more chaotic because they're arguing with each other and they're fighting over all this stuff, and it's closing in. The more intense it gets and the louder it gets, the closer they all kind of close in around the central character until he's completely inside of this super tight huddle that is extremely loud, and all the people waving their arms and they're angry at each other and they're insisting, no, it's mine. And then boom, and you hear this loud bang, and the smoke rises up from the middle of the group and everything stops, and they slowly back away, and as they look, smoke is rising and he's on the ground with a gun in his hand. And I said, because that's how I felt. That's how I felt with sola scriptura. That's how I felt as if we're all just desperate for this answer, like we're these wolves that are so starving and we just need this food. And God takes a Bible that's like a big slab of bloody meat and throws it in the middle of the wolves and says, go at it. Best of luck. And I feel like that would be how sola scriptura plays itself out. Everybody. And it was frustrating because, I have well-intended friends and family that believe that, even to this day. And they would tell me, well, you got to read the Bible. I'm like, I've read the Bible way more than you. And I know people who've read it way more than me. I know scholars like John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul who, people that I know, they admire these two guys. And they have differences over infant baptism. And so they have these dialogues, right? These discussions. They believe they're both Christian. They believe they're both going to heaven. But they have a difference over that whole one faith, one Lord, one baptism thing, apparently. Right? And so, and what would be the answer? Well, they got to read the Bible. These guys can read it in multiple languages. They have. They've preached it for years. And then people say, well, you should pray about it. Well, you think that these two guys didn't go and pray and beg God, say, look, I just want to know the truth. I desperately want to know. You don't think that they've done that? And then they come back, and guess what? They still believe what they believe. And then what's the answer? Well, we should go back and study the Bible. Well, there's a carnival ride for you, right? That's a vicious circle if I've ever seen one. And so you just keep going round and round you go. So that was absurd to me, right? But more personally, it was the issue of orders, because I'd been pastor. I'd worked in youth ministry, and I worked as an associate pastor that was striving to be a senior pastor. Okay, so I'd gone to Bible college, but when I read Catholic Controversy by St. Francis de Sales, when I read that, I was cornered in. I mean, I was boxed in this corner by him to say, who sent you? Who gave you that authority? Did you assume it for yourself? And if you say you base it on the Bible, show us in the Bible where you have the pastor who just said, well, you know what? I wasn't commissioned by anybody. None of the apostles set me up. No bishop set me up. I just felt in my heart that God called me to the ministry, so I started my own thing.
Yeah, there was the case of Simon that wanted to buy the office, remember?
Yeah, it didn't work out too good for that guy, right? The closest thing I heard was somebody said, well, what about Paul? And I'm like, well, did you get knocked off of a horse with this crazy, borderline psychedelic vision of the glorified Christ, right? That it ascended. Did you that you see this bright light and you're blinded and a miracle happens? And I said, even that wasn't enough, because Paul submitted himself so that he would know that he wasn't running and doing it in vain. Why? Couldn't he say, well, look, if Pastor Joe Blow over there, if Pastor Joe Blow is a pastor because he felt in his heart that that's the case, then I think that the Apostle Paul wouldn't need to go talk to anybody, because he was blinded, knocked off a horse, radically transformed. A guy comes and does miracles. He can see again. Paul's doing all these amazing things and wonders and stuff. I mean, if Pastor Joe Blow is legit without needing to go, then Paul definitely doesn't. But what does Paul do? Paul goes and says, I submitted myself, so that he would know, and it would be confirmed that in fact he wasn't. And what happened? Well, you're going to be the messenger to the Gentiles. Okay, so he had a jurisdiction too. It wasn't just simply so the aim of his mission, right? It was confined to something. He was given order in this. Me, never. And I read that, and it was so convicting, David. I can't even begin to tell you how I felt to sit there and say, have I been running in vain? And who would I go to? Because people said, well, why don't you go to the leadership? Because I worked at a Baptist church, but I mean, there was a legitimate reason why the pastor said you got to stop being a Calvinist. I mean, I held a lot of views that were Westminster Confession stuff, right? I wasn't even like just a Reformed Baptist like James White or anything like that. But who could I go to? Let's say I went to, I went to the elders. I went to deacons at another church. Or I went to a pastor over here. Or let's say I was part of a denomination, and the denomination certified me and then said, well, we're going to send you there. Who gave them that power? Where did they get it? Did they just assume it? And where do we get this idea that power is not conferred by power, but that it's assumed by powerless? Where do we get this?
I was talking with an atheist today on Facebook, and we were talking about the principle of proportionate causality. He doesn't believe in it, and I said, well, you can't do science without it. But he wanted me to give another example that didn't have to do with material, sort of natural science. He wanted something to do with agency. So I said, well, with agency, you don't have authority unless you submit to authority. And he said, that's not true. You don't need to derive your authority from anyone else. Where do these people think authority comes from, if not from above?
Magic. It's magic thinking. It just is. There's no the idea that, well, or maybe they'll pull the revolutionary stunt of saying that it's, the people, whatever that may mean, right?
Where did Satan think that he had his authority from when he was quoting scripture to Jesus in the desert?
I don't think he was assuming authority beyond the power of the air and the world and what he could offer, which is why he had to twist the meaning of it, right? He couldn't preach it faithfully. He was stuck with misleading ideas and using it in a way that is deranged, especially against the source of it, right? You're talking to the source of the thing, and so, but even his authority, he can't do things without being permitted, and so he can't go outside of that. So I mean, even he. As renegade and autonomous as people kind of treat him, that even he is limited by that, because God is the ultimate authority. He's the honcho. He's the buck stops here on everything. That's what it is. And so the idea that I could just assume this idea, there was no way to do it. Now, that was the first time, okay? The second time, coming back, there were things that it actually took me a while. Like I said, when we first started going back, it was a gradual thing. There were events. It wasn't actually an apologetic argument. It's not like I went online and said, "Oh man, the Kalam argument is mega dope. That convinces me." No way. I didn't. That was not how I approached this. A lot of it was accidental. Like, I read a book called Life of the Mind by Father James Shaw, if I'm remembering his first name properly. Brilliant guy. I just thought it was like, what do people do when they're out of school, but they're autodidacts and bibliophiles, and they just love learning, they love reading, because that's what my life, So I was out of school, and I was getting kind of missing it and saying, man, I long for that. And here it's stories about Hilary Belloc and about G.K. Chesterton, and mainly about Belloc, though, and how he would go on these walks, and how he had been an atheist, right? And how he'd come to this faith, and he did it by going on walks. And so I started just going on these walks. I was shocked, that this was even about Belloc. I didn't know it. But I'd been a distributist, and I still admired Belloc. I admired Chesterton. I admired the whole gang, Arthur Penny, all of them. And so I stuck with the book. I didn't put it down. I said, I'm going to read this book. And so I read it, and these walks that I would go on, I'd cry, and I would think through these questions, and I would think through who I was and why I was doing what I was doing. What's my worldview? Why if I believe that that it's meaningless, right, then what is up with what I'm doing? Why am I, and why do I have this malaise? Why, what Charles Taylor in his book The Secular Age, which a friend sent me a book after I was done with Life of the Mind, and Shaw and Belloc had been chipping away at me. A friend of mine had sent me a book, and the book was Reading Charles Taylor, by I think it's J.K. Smith. He's a teacher at Calvin College, and he's a Protestant guy, but he really likes Taylor. Taylor's a Catholic, and so it's kind of a summation of the book. It's just describing it, right? So because the Secular Age is, I think, 900 pages. I'm about 350 into it right now. So this book is much smaller, the J.K. Smith one, and I read that, and I was blown away by it, because while it's not strictly an apologetic approach to it, it's not saying, well, here's my argument, let me give you a syllogism, and you're going to be compelled by this, or, well, we can take a bunch of arguments and smash them together, and we're going to hope that maybe it's more probable that this is the case. It doesn't do that at all. He says, I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you about how we went from a place where belief in God, transcendence, hierarchy, porousness, that's the idea that spiritual things can affect you, right? And that it's not just your brain and knowing facts, but that, you can be affected even in your attitude or your zeal by something outside of you that can affect you, even curses and stuff back in the day, and today. But these ideas, and how did we go from that and then get to a place where we are today, where to say that you believe in God, you are in the dock? How did that happen? Because the secular story is a real simple one. Well, science happened and everybody just stopped believing in God. that's tiddlywink stuff. That's ridiculous. And so it's the story that he tells is fantastic, and it not only does it make sense of the developments of reforms even within the Catholic Church and counter-reformations and how this affects society and elites and how they apply Christian morality in different ways and new avant-garde things, the role of philosophy, the role of technics, things like this. And once we get to this place of secularism, this idea, well, there's, we're just stardust kind of stuff, and that's all we are, and we're on this little blue dot in the middle of nowhere doing nothing kind of thing, that people still have these desires and these concerns and these frustrations and this malaise. And he talks about death cab for cutie and leaps of death cab for cutie as examples of this. And it was just so powerful because it resonated. I was one of those atheist people that strongly believed that we needed to have something like church, because they don't have any, they have nothing for babies, right? There's no massive thing that like baptism or dedication or anything like that. So there's not even really celebrations for it. Of course, so many of them are contracepting themselves to death, and there's abortion is in vogue, and so and of course, because of the environment, we shouldn't have babies, or maybe because we're white people, we shouldn't have babies, or there's a lot of reasons to just not have kids. Pornography, of course, is causing problems. So there's all these issues that they have, but babies just don't seem to be a big deal for them. So the baby thing, marriage, right? Marriage, they don't have this big thing. Death. There's the idea. So many of them it's this hyper individualistic thing. And there's no common place where they can actually go and do, let's say, missions, for example, which is weird for an atheist organization or atheist movement, because it's a movement almost completely dependent upon deconverts. It's hyper evangelistic because they ain't making babies, which means their organizations, unless people deconvert, their organizations will die. They will grow old, get wrinkly, and turn to dust. And they have no kids to pass it on to, unless you deconvert people. So they'll say, well, I'm not trying to, do that. No, definitely 100%. I mean, almost to a number, tons of them. And I know some that kind of, to each their own. But there's this revolutionary drive and this revolutionary spirit within it, evangelistic. And not only that, but I realized soon enough, I was doing speeches at places, Sunday Assembly and CF, Center for Inquiry, and other places, Secular Student Alliance, to try to describe this idea of doing this. But here's the problem. Take Sunday Assembly. Take any of these groups. They lack what Jonathan Haidt would call in his moral foundations theory. They lack the foundation of hierarchy and authority. They're hyper individualistic, hyper democratic, right? This idea of hierarchy, you see how they're against it all the time. Whether it's their drive for a more direct democracy, whether it is their dislike for anything that ends with archy,
except for anarchy.
Right? Yeah. And so they get themselves in this place where even the best hope that they've got would be places like, for example, Sunday Assembly. And I know people there, and I've been invited to speak, and they were really, really polite about my daughter. Some of the people that were there that I know were involved with that group, my daughter went. I was the speaker that they invited for their grand opening in Grand Rapids. And we had so many people, it got close to 100, and we weren't allowed to have more come in. They had to wait outside, or they couldn't even come in because we were beyond the code, fire code. And they came for that. And so there was an excitement there. It dwindled real fast. And the reason why, number one, why are you coming? What actually are you coming for? They can say, well, a celebration of life. Okay, what's the topic? Do you have a liturgy? Well, no, we have to think of what we're going to do next week. It's so random. And they don't have any authoritative structure that groups in the history of groups need in order to have a transgenerational continuity where they keep going. They don't have it. And they don't have a moral code that is at the same time strong and firm enough to be like a maypole that people keep dancing around that and finding that common core, and yet at the same time loose enough that it's not shepherding, right? It's not like the shepherding movement where you got to ask your pastor if you can paint the walls in your house. And so they lack that golden mean of that standard. They don't have that. And because of their tendency, atheists, to be progressive and liberal, they find themselves in our current condition of being increasingly committed to for no better choice of term, social justice warriorship, right? SJWism, right? This kind of cultural Marxism, whatever people want to call it. And there is this real freaky authoritarian strain in that, right? The activist authoritarianism that doesn't permit dissent. And so they lack those things that are necessary. And I started figuring this out. And I said, man, we're hosed. And we had kids. We're one of the only families in this organization that had them. Weren't meant friends like that. A lot of people, they didn't share our values. And it just more and more and more and more and more. But the biggest thing that was hard was I said, I have my values I have in common with the Catholic people and the Christian people, because that's where they developed. And that's where they became coherent for me in my life, in the worldview. But I don't share their dogmas. And so if I went to the church, would they allow me, or would they be like, this guy's actually dangerous? I mean, he's not even a Christian yet. He keeps coming here. Maybe we shouldn't let the kids go over to their house. Their values aren't the same, because they have a maypole. Right? They have, and I'm using that term metaphorically, they have that catechism. They have the creeds. They have their dogmas. They have things that they must submit to. And I wouldn't submit to it. And so I believe in so much this, and I identify with them more. But I share the dogma. And these people over here that I do share the beliefs about, well, there's not a God, or at least more is, and I don't want, theocracy, and I don't want the Bible doing this to us, and all this, and that's what I believed. But all of the values that they had, and these ideas, it was a terrible pressure in my life, and I was caught. And when we came back to the church through the kids, being there got me to the place where I realized that I needed to pray, and the liturgy worked on me. Right, that's a real deal. You go, and you are in a place of humility, and you're in a place of brokenness, and you're surrounded by majesty, mystery, and awe, and God's presence is right there. You are bound to. You better watch it, bud. if you don't want that, because God is a relentless hunter of souls, and that's what happens. He uses the term of a shepherd going to find his lamb. He is valiant in his search, and he sacrificed his life for us, right? So that began to lead me there. And eventually, even when I had my doubts, I was praying. I said, God, help my unbelief. And after a year, I was given spiritual penance, kind of. It was a spiritual advisement in penance for what I had done as an enemy of the church, for a year of silence and a year of sacraments and prayer. And I did it. I stayed away from social media like I was told. I think I posted like 4 or 5 times, and it was always something that was like an announcement of my nothing to do with politics, religion, nothing. I wasn't on radio anymore. I didn't do podcasts. I didn't do YouTube. I went to church for probably, oh boy, I think I went to church at least 330 days maybe out of the year. I mean, I would go as often as I possibly could, and I prayed every day, and I begged God, help my unbelief, right? Help me to get to a place where I believe. And through a lot of things that I've listed, actually, for a good friend of mine, an author friend by the name of Brett Fawcett. He's also from Canada. But Brett uh, I sent a list to him as it grew of things that helped me to get to where I am now. And I don't have doubts about the Lord anymore. I don't have answers, David, on everything. People would ask, I'm writing a book about my daughter's life and death and how it led us to the church. And I know people, and I guess if they're listening to this, they'll find out, but I don't have an answer for the problem of evil. I don't, if someone says, well, why did God do that? Well, that is going to be actually my first question when I make it to heaven, God willing. I'm not presumptuous about this. And so, but even in light of that and in spite of that, I don't doubt him. I believe in him, and I have a hope that I will see him and that I will see my daughter. And so, all of those things. So it was easy. In fact, both of them took a good year and a half, actually, interestingly enough, the first time and the second time. And they were difficult for different reasons. But the first time it was difficult. It was easier, I would say, because I didn't go through the loss of my daughter. And the second one was harder because I had to overcome not just intellectual arguments, but a darkness in my heart.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for sharing that. So at the end of my episodes, I do ask my guests to give the closing thought. So just to wrap up the show, what do you think that you might be able to say to someone that's out there listening now?
When I was going through the stuff with my daughter, all of the chemo and the radiation, the 6-hour biopsy, the 17-hour surgery, all of the medical treatments and the therapy, and eventually the recurrence, the vomiting, the paralysis, eventually the blindness, her inability to communicate anymore. These things were so hard, not just in the moment, but afterward for a long time. And they still are. There's times I'm actually shocked that I've made it through this interview without crying. It may be a first for me, in fact. But through all of that, there was a phrase. There's two things. Number one, my daughter had a motto. And that motto was very simple, and it made her very dear to a lot of people and to me. And it was this, and it was Make-A-Wish, in fact, selected her as their highlighted ambassador of the year in Michigan because, in part, due with this. And her motto was, never give up and keep on smiling. And so from kind of a ecumenical and even a secular angle on this of just saying in general, people, regardless of where you are in your life, okay, whether you are a Christian, whether you're Protestant, whether you're Catholic, whether you're an atheist, wherever you're coming from, and no matter what you're going through, that you can do it, and that you should never give up, no matter what, and keep on smiling, and to do your best. And that doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. It doesn't mean that you're not going to make mistakes. It doesn't mean that things aren't going to be extremely painful or extremely hard. You're going to go through things that will feel like the world is literally caving in around you. But I learned from that girl, from this amazing young girl that I have the honor and privilege of calling my daughter. I learned from her and seeing her go through all of those things that never once did she break on that. And never once did she say, why me? She was grateful to be alive. And the other thing is this, is that there was the godmother that I mentioned about my son and how we went back to this church with the godmother. She came into the hospital unexpected, in fact uninvited, but she was there. And we talked after, as she came with the priest, actually, and he prayed over our daughter. He was the only cleric of any denomination or religion or anything to come and pray over our daughter. And as they were leaving, this really short, probably a 5'2" Italian grandma, real pretty, and she came up to me and she's looking up in my eyes and she's crying and she says, Jeremiah, she said, you have to believe that God loves you. that God loves Sammy, that God loves your family. You have to believe this. And I didn't at the time. In fact, I couldn't believe in God, and I could only believe if there was a God that he was quite mean and vengeful and in an unjustifiable way. But I'd come to learn that, through different experiences in my life and through different thoughts and different trials and everything else, that God does love me, that Jesus loves me, and that we can know this, not just in an intellectual way, but in a sacramental way and in a spiritual way. And I know it's hard in our modern world that likes to believe that the only thing around us is what we can taste and touch and feel and everything else. But I think that for those who are in a place where they say, you know what, I'm broken and I need help, they do have to get used to one thing, though, is that, especially for people who come from a background like I came from with being an atheist, that coming back, accept the fact that you've wrestled with God and that you'll probably walk with a limp because he doesn't lose. And as long as you can grant that, then it'll be a lot like it was with me when I went back and the priest realized I was there, and he looked at me and he said, "You are literally the last person in all the world I would have ever imagined seeing here." And as I was walking out, he said, "Welcome home, prodigal son." And in that way, he really was speaking in the place of Christ to me. And I've become increasingly convinced by humility, by prayer, by persistence, by solitude, getting off of social stinking media. Okay, do it for a while. There's hope, and God is there. And so, and I'm always here. If people want to contact me and speak with me, even if they want to, fine. I've been a lightning rod for a long time. I don't mind this. But if you're interested to reach out to me, you're more than welcome. I'm always willing to talk to people, and I wish them the best no matter what. And I wish to be friends with people no matter where they are, for who they are. And that would be what I would say.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is